Oh, yes, I love it. I had lots, but I shared them all last
Okay.
week.
All right. So today we'll get into Jesus as Jesus and wisdom, and Borg points out at the very beginning of this chapter that wisdom was critical, or wisdom is critical. The concept of wisdom is critical for understanding what the New Testament has to say about Jesus. And he distinguishes between what he'll deal with in this chapter, which is Jesus as a teacher, and then in the next chapter, he'll deal with Jesus as the embodiment of divine wisdom. So here, we're just talking about Jesus as a teacher. Next time, we'll talk about how Jesus embodied wisdom and what he did and how he lived. So Borg wants to set the stage for this by talking about what is wisdom as a concept, or as a, not a concept, a category, I guess. And he asserts that wisdom is that stuff that concerns how to live, the nature of reality, and how to live one's life in accord with that reality. And I think we can all attest to this. If we've dealt with children, they crash into reality, and we've learned through our experiences growing old that we can avoid crashing into reality, and that's what we call wisdom. We learned different ways to deal with reality. Wisdom speaks of a way or a path, Borg writes, and there's a distinction between the right way and the wrong way. And we see that in a lot of different traditions. And he points out that there are two different types of wisdom, and therefore two types of sages, those who are the teachers of this of wisdom. There's conventional wisdom, and it has a conventional sage. And then there, which is the mainstream wisdom of a culture. What everybody knows is what he says, or in line with my sermon from a couple weeks ago, you might call it common sense. That stuff that everybody thinks. And then he distinguishes that conventional wisdom from subversive or alternative wisdom, and therefore subversive sages. And he points out, some examples of who those subversive sages would have been, and he singles out Lao Tzu, the Taoist. He singles out the Buddha, or in the West, Socrates, teachers of an alternative wisdom, contrary to that of the dominant culture.
They want to talk?
Whoops.
Is everybody still there?
Yep. You're here.
Is the share screen still there?
No.
Okay.
You aren't.
All right. There we go.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I've got some weird connections going on, and if I bump the computer the wrong way, things go away. Trying to resolve that. So, of course, Lao Tzu, great teacher of Taoism. Tao, that word, T-A-O or D-A-O, just means the way or the path. So clearly, there's that tie between this alternative wisdom and the path. And Borg points out then that the wisdom of the subversive sages is the road less traveled, or the path less traveled. So he starts, after that introductory set of comments, he starts talking about how did Jesus teach wisdom? And we had an example this morning. He uses parables and he uses aphorisms. So as an oral teacher, he uses these aphorisms and parables. Aphorisms being memorable sayings or one-liners, and then parables, short stories. So we had the short story this morning with the vineyard story. They are, and what Borg points out is they're invitational forms of speech. They tease the imagination and suggest more than you might think. They suggest more than they say, and they invite a transformation in perception. And so aphorisms, these pithy one-liners are, you can't serve two masters. Borg points out that people could understand that, but they'd want to play with it, right? How do I or don't I serve two masters? What does that mean in my life? For me, it's an invitation to think about that. What does it mean to leave the dead to bury the dead? This is just one of those things that's a puzzlement. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. People will smile about that and then wonder how much they worry about the teeny stuff, right? So there are invitations to really sort of go into your mind and ponder these things. He says they need time for digestion. And even though, excuse me, even though the Gospels, especially Matthew and Luke, might string all of these together, like in the Sermon on the Mount, Borg says they wouldn't have been strung together. Jesus would have brought them out as zingers in conversation. So you wouldn't be sitting there thinking about being the light of the world and then being the salt of the earth and then thinking the salt of the, they would be spread apart, so that the idea of there we go. So that you would really have to kind of work on them. Some of them, he points out, are arresting. They capture, because of the context. I would imagine that if Jesus would have told the story that we heard this morning, and the scribes, the chief priests and the Pharisees weren't there, people would have heard it differently than they did with Jesus being in controversy with them. Some require reflection out of wonder as to why were they spoken. What's the metaphor being employed here in those kinds of things? What's the metaphor of gnat and camel? How does that work? And then he talks about parables. They can be like aphorisms, but are narratives. So they're stories, full-fledged stories. And probably he told them more than once with variations. And I think any of us would recognize this. How many of us tell stories about our childhood, but depending on who we're talking to or what we're talking about, we may emphasize one aspect of that story over another, or we may delete some details because that person may not have any context for understanding that detail. And as any good story goes, Jesus's parables draw the listener into the story. There's an invitation to participate in that story. And one of the things that Borg points out is that these stories then don't involve an external authority. Their authority rests within the story itself, because you're the one that has to sort of work through it, recognizing that it speaks to you in a particular way. And so you'll remember all of these statements in most of the Gospels, where the crowd marvels at Jesus' teaching because he taught with authority, not like the scribes, whose all of their teaching was derivative. So here Jesus' teachings have their own authority in and of themselves. They don't appeal to something else. So Borg writes that Jesus invited the audience to see in a radically new way, appealing to the imagination. And he writes, how we see determines the path that we walk or the way that we live. So the stories invite us to see in a different way. both perhaps literally and metaphorically, to see in a different way. And what we see then determines how we walk, what path we follow. And he concludes this, this section by saying, Jesus wasn't a teacher of information or morals, but a teacher of a way or a path of transformation from a life in the world of conventional wisdom to a life centered in God. So what do you make about that? Any thoughts, questions, comments on that function of Jesus teaching as a teaching through aphorisms and parables?
Well, I loved it. And I was obviously very taken with the obvious statement, and I've known them both, that both Socrates and Jesus were executed. It was a legal killing of someone because of the difference in thought. Socrates believed that there was one divine being and only one God, and he, she, it was not anthropomorphic. And that was his sin. That was what caused him to die. And Jesus was crucified. One of the prayers in the prayer book that I have used every single week and made a commitment to myself to pray every week is those who are in jail and are suffering. And the first line deals with the fact that Jesus was a criminal. And we forget that. We don't want to think about Jesus being a criminal in his day. So this chapter brought up the idea that he was stepping outside the box. And that was something that scared the people in power who were there basically with the approval of the Romans. And it's just, it was a powerful chapter to me.
Now, of course, Socrates was accused of corrupting the morals of the youth.
Yes, yes.
It was interesting for me as I went through the chapter and then I reflected back on it. And this is only for me, but what hit me was that conventional wisdom was coming from the mind and the alternative wisdom was coming from the heart. And that's just the way I saw it.
Nice observation.
You know, I think one of the things that I think was interesting is that when you teach the way Jesus did with aphorisms and parables, it's harder to refute the truth.
Yes.
Because it doesn't conform to black and white thinking. And it's easier to just out and out say la 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 when it talks to black and white thinking. But when it's this kind of teaching, where it invites you to dig deeper, then it's more likely to piss people off because it's harder to refute just straight across the board.
Mm-hmm.
He might have lived if he just taught in black and white and they could say, well, he's a wacko, move on.
Sounded like somebody else was going to say something.
I was just going to, what Elaine said is sort of like what I was thinking, except Jesus gives space because it's not black and white. He gives space for pondering, space for figuring out, space. And I just really like that so it might not have been so good for him, but I think it's really good news for me.
If you think back to the last chapter, I think it was the last chapter, where Board points out, that Jesus really expanded who could be at the table.
Oh, yes.
That hospitality side. that means that there's an expansiveness to how we are allowed to think, right? It's not just the people at the table, but how we are allowed to approach God or approach life, that it's not circumscribed by a particular set of dogma or details. So yeah, I think that's right in line, Carla.
Just to expound on that, on page 86, this one paragraph, the first full paragraph, talks about what Jim was talking about. The path involved uses imagery of the heart to speak of the need for internal transformation. Ancient Jewish philosophy, generally the heart represented the self at its deepest level. And when the heart is centered on the finite, it becomes closed and hardened rather than open and receptive. And it reminded, well, the book has reminded me often of, I want to say the Book of Joy with the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I mean, it just, the two of them are spiritual leaders who love each other. Deepest heart. And it's that book is such a joy. It is just a joy to read their thoughts and how they communicate, the fact they could share in each other's traditional service, and they did, joke with each other. And then the other thing with me was, I taught in high school with a lot of Mormon kids. And I remember growing up where the question of Mormons being Christian was maybe, I think before I was even in 8th grade, Mike, but my father said anybody who believes Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ is a Christian. I had a Mormon friend at the time, and there wasn't any proselytizing done to me. They knew I was a Presbyterian, so they didn't try. But it was obvious they believed that Jesus was the Christ. And teaching in a high school with so many Mormon kids who were terrific human beings, I let them know I believed they were Christian, not something else. So I think that's a part of it. And the other thing that came to mind was the play Waiting for Godot. Because they constantly are waiting. And they just keep waiting. That's the part. We just keep waiting. So I think the heart, the mind, the acceptance of people who aren't fitting the conventional, and I really liked it. I really liked it.
So that gets to this next discussion point about how we see differently, and how that has an impact on our spiritual journey. What comments do other folks have at this point?
I like the idea that the way he taught was invitational. And if you walk away knowing what he said as a parable, you're not going to know what it means immediately. And that is very good for somebody who's being subversive, because he'll be long gone before you realize what happened. And not only that, but it's very hard to take the parable and use it as evidence in a court case against you. So, that's all very clever, but the fact of the matter is, you do have to commit yourself to figuring it out. And once you do, what you figured out from the parable may not be the same as what the person next to you came up with. So it invites not only you to get into the parable, but then to get into some kind of discussion with someone else about how you would go about living because this parable exists.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think to some extent the brilliance of parables is that they are so applicable to so many different circumstances, because they are non-specific, and we can look at our own situation and how they apply to us, and someone else looks at their situation and it applies totally differently to them, and yet we all basically come to the same kind of general conclusion from it, although that in practice it may be very different.
It used to be, and this has changed a little bit over the last 20 or 30 years, that scholars distinguished between parables and allegories and sort of poo-pooed allegories, where one thing stood for another, like we had in our story this morning, that the tenants were clear, they figured out, oh, they're telling that about us. The problem with making that distinction is that then the allegory is stuck in its age. And to see it still as a parable, we could sit back, and maybe I invited us to do that this morning, sit back and say, where am I as chief priest or a Pharisee in this situation? Or a tenant, what am I a tenant of, where I'm demanding all of the goodies? And so that, even though there may have been an original allegory, it doesn't bind it to that one only in and of itself. Yeah.
What's the distinction there between the parable and the allegory? Aren't they both metaphorical?
Well, in a parable, if you think about the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed.
Yeah.
That's a parable in and of itself. It's also kind of a one-liner. It's hard to say, well, there isn't sort of an exact correlation between one thing and another. I mean, how does that work? Mustard seed, how's, and we get into that a little bit more. But if you think about a vineyard being Israel and, the grapes are supposed to do certain things, you can apply, there's this one-to-one correspondence that works as an allegory. And so I think part of what I'm hearing you ask, Mark, is part of why the scholars sort of stepped back from making such a stark distinction. But the point that the parables don't, the distinction is that the parables aren't, it's quite one-to-one. The pearl of great price, here's this guy finds a pearl, buries it, goes, sells the field and buys it. What the world does that mean? So they don't work in quite the same way as something that's quite direct as the parable we had this morning. So he goes on to say that, the problem is conventional wisdom. And as I mentioned when we started, conventional wisdom is the dominant consciousness of any culture. He writes that it's the most taken for granted understandings about the way things are and about the way to live, enculturated consciousness. And it features, the features of conventional wisdom provides guidance about how to live, embodies the central values of a culture. You think about this, I'll just use this. I think, for Americans, conventional culture is to drive on the right side of the road, and we use a measuring system that nobody else in the world uses. That's our conventional wisdom. You go anywhere else, they may drive on the right side of the road, but they're using metric system, and then there are the Brits, right? So that's conventional wisdom, something that's enculturated in the culture. It's based on the, here I think he's really getting into it though. He says it's based on the dynamic of rewards and punishments, conventional wisdom. If you do this, this will happen, either good or bad. It has both social and psychological consequences. It creates a world of hierarchies and boundaries. You can think back a couple of chapters to the culture of purity. Again, these boundaries and hierarchies. Becomes the basis for identity and self-esteem. And it creates a world in which we live. It constructs, conventional wisdom constructs a world. And if we go back to that culture of purity, that constructed a world. It was a very constrained world. As he points out, he says, it's a life of limited vision and vileness. You're always comparing yourself against somebody else in this world. It's a world of striving with concerns about performance, and he points out that it fosters a life of profound self-preoccupation. How am I doing? How am I doing? Am I working my way up the ladder? And then he points out, that Christian life then becomes a life of requirements. and he ends the section with this delightful story that, growing up as a Lutheran, where you're saved by grace, not by works, well, you had to have faith. And faith became its own work. If you didn't have enough faith, you weren't going to get the grace. And so he said, even Lutherans turned that magnanimous grace that God offers into a work, because conventional wisdom is so powerful. And he also pointed out that requirement of faith then divided the world into those who have it and those who don't. So it's still a divisive piece, and that's all part of conventional wisdom, and it can be laid over Christianity. Yeah.
My husband just brought me coffee, and I.
Okay.
Saying thank you.
Yes.
And so he in this little bit about this conventional wisdom, he right before he gets into it, he says, that a way of transformation is from a life in the world of conventional wisdom to a life centered in God. So how would you understand that transition, that movement, that transformation, that way of transformation from that conventional wisdom in which we are so thickly embroiled into a life centered on God? What do you understand by that?
So this is a little strange, but there's a story that I heard a long time ago about a newlywed who was cooking a ham, and she took this perfectly good ham and hacked the two ends off and put it in the roaster and put it in the oven. And her new husband looked at her and said, "Why do you do that?" And she said, "I don't know, my mom always did that." So she called her mom and said, "Why do we hack the ends of the ham off?" And her mom said, "I don't know, Grandma always used to do that." So they phoned Grandma and said, "Why do we hack the ends of the ham off?" And Grandma said, "I don't know, that's what my mom taught me." So they phoned great grandma in the nursing home, and she said, "My pan was too small." I think the way of transformation is shown by that husband who says, "Why do we do that?" Because if we don't ever question conventional wisdom, then we don't have the opportunity to say, I really believe this and I really don't believe that. We talk about God has no grandchildren. You can't really write in on the faith of the person who taught you your faith. You have to embrace it for yourself or not. I think that's a big piece of the way of transformation. And that's one of the things that I really, really appreciate about the Episcopal Church, about the Anglican tradition, is that we honor questions. Sherry Neerman, who used to be a member of Good Shepherd, always said, the best theological statement ends in a question mark. And I think that's a big piece of that.
When you were talking, Elaine, I thought about the death of my beloved music teacher when I was about 15, 16. I was in high school. And I was so worried because the conventional wisdom of the Presbyterian Church is that she was going to go to hell. And that was really tough on me. My father went to her service. I hadn't brought it up with him before that. But when he came back, I asked him how the service was. And he said it was a wonderful service and it fit Joanne. And then I brought it up and he said, "Irma, we don't know who is saved and not saved. Only God knows that." And I believe Joanne was saved. And that's what I needed to hear. But that belief in only the people who do what you've been taught to do in the Presbyterian Church, go to Sunday school every Sunday, go to church every Sunday, go to prayer meeting every Wednesday night, go to Youth for Christ on Saturdays. Only that makes you Christian. And that's kind of and being confirmed, that those rules, that structure, is important to break. And you're right, Elaine, about questions. It's just not wrong to question. Yeah, not wrong to question.
But once you've
Yeah,
stepped outside
any
of the
other-
convention, once you've stepped outside of that, there's still more to do, not just in denying what is conventional, but living out a relationship with God in doing things that are sort of come to mind or seem original or seem appropriate in that moment, praying that they'll be, that's exactly what God wants you to do. And sometimes you're wrong, but we're all talking about it breaking away from conventional. It's time to start thinking about what is it once you've broken that pattern. Where have you been? Where are you going?
Well, and I don't think it's necessarily all about breaking away, but I really do think it's about questioning, is this something that is part of the way I understand how the world should work? And then, yes, the new stuff needs to be incorporated and acted on. I think you're absolutely right.
So,
I started reading this morning Pope Francis's new encyclical on, it's called Family something, but the encyclical is basically, after COVID, are we going to continue in a nationalistic, capitalistic world, or are we going to use this as a moment to try to transform into a way of love instead of a way of division? So it fits within what we're talking about. I haven't read all the way through it, but he was already being, covered by some of the news people for his socialist attitudes. You can see the pushing against the conventional wisdom.
So what are the problems of conventional wisdom? And in what we've heard, what are those problems?
I listened to that description of the conventional wisdom, and it sounded like my working career. I got a degree, I worked hard, I got promoted, I made more money, and it just, that was how I went through life in my working career. So it really did sound like my working career.
And there's nothing the matter with that. But it's a theory. This was another thing I struggled with as a Presbyterian, and that's the theory of the elect. That there are certain people that are elected by God to be successful, and how you measure success. And that has been a real question in terms of my own life. And my own children did not succeed the way I succeeded, but my son is happy as a chef and now a dietitian and taking care of kids who don't have homes or in residential treatment like he was. And that's okay. I mean, that's just the way it has to be. But it's, yeah, Jim, it isn't all bad, but when you make that the sign that you're a good person, then it's bad. It's being able to be a good person and not necessarily follow all those rules, I think.
Go ahead, Carl.
So I was just thinking, Irma, that the conventional wisdom of the Presbyterian Church was putting you into a straitjacket. It was about transformation and getting closer to God. It was sort of ruling your life.
Yes.
There wasn't a relationship with God involved.
And very based on Judaism and what is talked about here as the purity of Judaism. Very based on that. And so
Irma, I'm going to interrupt just so that we can move along.
Not a problem.
That, what Borg points out is that this conventional wisdom turns God into a lawgiver and a judge.
Yes.
And you have to measure up, and that can be problematic, and that the consequences then, are pretty harsh. You always feel unworthy, or that you'll never measure up. I am a worm and no man. All those kinds of things. That really becomes pretty self-destructive.
And it creates,
So
ins and outs, the people who are in and the people who are out. It divides
Right.
us.
Yes, exactly.
And
He
it doesn't
moves
take
into how Jesus
consideration an
taught.
abundant God.
Say that again, Deb, sorry.
It doesn't take into consideration an abundant God
No.
who has love enough for all of us, even if we're failures at conventional wisdom, as I am.
So Borg goes on, it's 10 to 11, and I've got to prepare now for 11:30 service. And especially this first time, it's going to be a little hectic. But he then talks about, what did Jesus teach? What was this teaching? And he talked about how he did it, these aphorisms and parables. And then he points out how he did it, or the what was it that he did. And he talks about so many of the things have these impossible combinations abound in his teaching. For example, how are Samaritan and Pharisee used? Talking to a Jewish audience, making the Samaritan a good guy is impossible. Making the Pharisees and the chief priests the bad guys is impossible. These reversals. Kingdom of God, how can it be a mustard seed? All of those kinds of things. They're paradoxes in what he was teaching. Who does he eat with? This is not conventional. This is not conventional. And then he goes on, like most sages, Borg points out, like most sages, Jesus taught that conventional wisdom was the broad way. And we hear Jesus saying, enter by the narrow gate, right? Or, you can't go through this gate like a camel can't go through the eye of a needle, right? So there's this sense that it's not easy to buck convention. And he attacks, through all of this, he attacks a lot of the social world's conventional wisdom, right? Behold, your mother and brother. He said, no, my mother and brother are over here. Jesus was not a teacher of family values in that same way, right? He, in a culture that valued wealth, he didn't. In a culture that valued honor, he redefined it. And as we've already talked about, in a culture that centralized purity, he didn't. Those were all reversals that Jesus taught and acted. And this was subversive. And like Socrates, teaching subversive wisdom gets you into trouble, right? Are there other ways that you can think of that Jesus taught subversively?
Can I be subversive and suggest that this chapter needs 2 weeks?
We could come back to it, or we could. What are you feeling, Deb?
Well, I'm just feeling like there is so much more in this chapter that we can't hope to even skim it in 10 minutes. And so why not just take another week on it?
I can do that. What do the rest of you think? I see Mary Ann nodding her head.
Yeah,
There's a lot in there.
sounds good.
I think we're all there.
All right, Jim raised his thumb. That's Gregory's doing this.
As I thought.
He's dancing. All right. I'm happy then to cut off now, so that I can tend to getting this service done, and we'll come in and we'll finish this up next week, and maybe set the stage for the following week if we get that far.
I think this needs some thought as well as.
Oh, yes.
And
Okay.
so that would give us some time to think and feel on what.
All right, so let me ask you this. Towards the middle or end of the week, if in your thinking you've come up with some questions that you would really like us to mull over, send them to me and I'll put them in the slides.
Great.
Okay.
And we can mull over those questions rather than the folks who put together the study guide. I'm happy with that.
Okay.
All right, everybody.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you. Hope to see y'all soon.
Y'all later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.